By the middle of 1944, the Empire of Japan was fighting a losing war. Its once mighty navy lay shattered across the Pacific. Its air force, once feared, was now struggling to defend the homeland from the relentless advance of American forces. But even as Japanese soldiers fought on the islands of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, they had no idea that something far greater was coming. From the runways of distant American bases, engineers, scientists, and pilots were preparing to unleash a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen before, a weapon that would bring the war to Japan's very heart. It was called the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. To the American airmen who flew it, it was the most advanced aircraft ever built, a masterpiece of engineering, power, and precision. To the Japanese who would soon face it, it would become a symbol of terror, destruction, and the unstoppable reach of American industry. The B-29 was born from the skies of innovation. Designed in the early 1940s, it was unlike any bomber before it. It was faster, larger, and could fly higher than anything the Japanese possessed. With a range of over 5,000 miles, the Superfortress could strike targets across Asia from bases far beyond the reach of enemy aircraft. But its true advantage lay in its altitude. The B-29 could fly at over 30,000 feet, nearly twice the height at which Japanese Zero fighters operated effectively. At that height, the air was thin and frigid. Japanese pilots who tried to climb that high found their engines gasping for air, their controls sluggish, their visibility clouded by frost. To the men inside the B-29, the experience was surreal. They looked down upon the Earth as if from another world, a world of silence and thin blue air, where the only sounds were the deep hum of their four Wright R-3350 engines and the faint crackle of the intercom. The crew of a B-29 numbered 11 men. Each had a role to play in keeping the giant machine alive. The pilot and co-pilot guided her massive wings through the sky. The bombardier watched the world through a Norden bomb sight, the most advanced targeting system of its time. Gunners manned their remote-controlled turrets, guided by gyroscopic aiming computers, technology so advanced that Japanese intelligence at first refused to believe it existed. The aircraft's skin shimmered like polished steel, reflecting the sunlight. At a distance, it looked serene, almost peaceful, but to those who lived beneath its shadow, it would soon become the face of death. The first B-29 raids began in June 1944, launched from bases in India and China as part of Operation Matterhorn. These early missions were plagued with logistical challenges. The aircraft had to fly over the Himalayas, a deadly route known as the Hump, to reach their forward bases. Each gallon of fuel and each bomb had to be carried over mountains higher than any in Japan.
The Japanese High Command was aware of the operation, but they underestimated it. They believed the Americans would never be able to sustain large-scale bombing operations from such distant and dangerous bases. They were wrong. On June 15, 1944, the first B-29 raid struck the Yawata Steelworks on Yawata Island. It was the first time Japan had been bombed since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. But this time, it wasn't a symbolic strike. It was a taste of what was to come. Japanese radar detected the bombers long before they arrived. The order was given for interception. Fighter squadrons scrambled from their airfields, their Zeros clawing their way into the sky. The men who took off that morning were veterans, aces who had fought over China, over the Solomons, over the Coral Sea. They knew how to fight American bombers. Or so they thought. As they climbed, they spotted the formation, tiny silver dots glinting in the sunlight, far above the clouds. They pushed their engines harder, climbing past 25,000 feet, then 28,000, but the B-29s were still higher. The air grew thinner, their engines lost power, and their aircraft began to shudder. The Zero was never meant to fly this high. One pilot, Lieutenant Takeo Kato, later wrote in his diary that it felt as if he was trying to, quote, chase the moon. His guns froze, his canopy iced over, and his vision blurred as he tried to line up a shot. When he finally reached firing range, his bullets pinged harmlessly off the B-29's armored fuselage. Seconds later, the air filled with tracers from the bomber's defensive guns. Unlike the old B-17s or B-24s, the B-29's turrets were controlled remotely from inside the pressurized cabin, guided by sighting stations using periscopic lenses and analog computers. The result was deadly accuracy. In a matter of seconds, Kato's aircraft was hit. Smoke filled his cockpit. He dove toward the sea, barely escaping with his life. Dozens of others weren't so lucky. By the time the bombers turned for home, the Japanese defenders had failed to shoot down a single aircraft. Only mechanical failures and fuel shortages had claimed a few of the American giants. The damage to Iwata was limited, but the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, the Japanese people saw their homeland under attack by an enemy they couldn't touch. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread among the Japanese airmen. Some said the Americans had built a plane that could reach the stratosphere. Others whispered that the bombers were protected by invisible shields. The truth was even frightening. These machines were real, and more of them were coming. By the autumn of 1944, American engineers had established new bases on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. From there, the B-29 could strike every major city in Japan without having to cross mountains or rely on distant Chinese airfields. The stage was set for a campaign of destruction on the scale the world had never witnessed before. As the first superfortresses taxied onto the long coral runways of Tinian, the pilots looked to the north, toward Tokyo. They knew what awaited them. And so did the Japanese, though few dared to admit it aloud. Far above the Pacific, the balance of power was shifting, and soon the Empire of Japan would come face to face with the monster in the sky.
By late 1944, the sky above the Pacific had become an American domain. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, once considered Japan's unsinkable fortress line, were now under American control. Within months, these coral specks in the vast ocean had been transformed into the largest air bases the world had ever seen. From their runways stretched the future of warfare, miles of concrete, fuel lines, hangars, and endless rows of silver giants waiting for the order to strike. For the men who lived and worked there, it was an island world of heat, dust, and purpose. Engineers labored in the tropical sun to repair engines and load bombs. Pilots studied maps of Japan, tracing flight paths that led straight into the heart of the enemy. The distance from Tinian to Tokyo was about 1,500 miles, a range that only one aircraft in existence could cover with a full bomb load, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. And now, they had thousands of them. As winter fell over Japan, the first waves of B-29s began to rise from the Marianas, their engines shaking the night air with a deep, thunderous rhythm. Each carried up to 10 tons of bombs. Each could fly high enough that most Japanese fighters couldn't reach them. From their cockpits, the crews could see the curvature of the earth. The world below seemed fragile and distant. Oceans, clouds, and the faint outline of islands disappearing beneath them. Inside, the air was pressurized, warm, and filled with the smell of oil and metal. For the Japanese radar operators, the warning came too late. Their screens lit up with blips, dozens, then hundreds, forming a vast formation moving toward the homeland. The alarm spread across the islands. Sirens wailed. Searchlights cut through the night. Anti-aircraft guns turned upward. And then the bombs fell. The first great raids struck Nagoya, Osaka, and Tokyo. Precision bombing, as the Americans called it, aimed at factories, steelworks, and shipyards. But the reality was far less precise. Jet streams, powerful winds at high altitude unknown to American meteorologists, scattered the bomb patterns. Targets were missed, bombs drifted miles off course. The Japanese cities were massive, sprawling, and built mostly of wood. The bombs struck homes as often as they struck factories. Still, the devastation was undeniable. Fire spread through neighborhoods like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. For Japanese fighter pilots, it was a nightmare. They scrambled in their Ki-43 Oscars and Ki-84 Franks, newer and faster than the old Zero, but still struggling to reach the altitude of the B-29s. They climbed until their engines strained, fuel gauges dropped, and frost gathered on their canopies. Those who reached the bombers found themselves under withering fire. The Superfortress bristled with 10.5 caliber machine guns, all guided by advanced fire control systems. Each gunner could track and fire at multiple attackers using remote turrets that swiveled automatically toward threats. A single B-29 could defend itself from multiple directions at once. A formation of 100 was a moving fortress, a city in the sky armed with walls of lead.
Japanese pilots attacked anyway. Some dove head-on, others from below, where the bombers' defenses were weakest. They came in with blazing guns, screaming prayers into the radio, determined to bring down at least one of the giants. The results were devastating. Out of dozens who took off, only a few returned. The others vanished into the sea or the mountains, victims of gunfire, engine failure, or exhaustion. Reports from the surviving pilots painted a grim picture. They described the B-29s as machines from another world, fast, powerful, and impossible to destroy. One ace, Captain Haru Onoda, wrote that shooting at them was like throwing stones at a mountain. On the ground, Japanese civilians learned to fear the deep rumble of distant engines. Children covered their ears. Families fled to bomb shelters as the sky filled with glowing trails. It was said that even before the first explosion, people could feel the pressure in their chests, the vibration of the Superfortress passing overhead. But for all their power, the early B-29 raids were not as effective as American commanders hoped. Precision bombing required clear skies and daylight, and the weather over Japan was often unpredictable. Heavy clouds, strong winds, and poor visibility made high-altitude attacks unreliable. Bombs often missed their targets entirely. In Washington, frustration grew. The B-29 program had cost more than $2 billion, more than the entire Manhattan Project. Yet Japan's war production continued. General Curtis LeMay, newly appointed commander of the 21st Bomber Command, decided that things had to change. LeMay was a man of results, not theories. He had no patience for wasted missions or idealistic notions of surgical bombing. He believed in one thing: breaking the enemy's will to fight. And he knew exactly how to do it. If the bombs couldn't find their targets from 30,000 feet, then the bombers would go lower. If steel and concrete wouldn't burn, then wood and paper would. In the early months of 1945, LeMay began to reorganize the bombing campaign. He stripped the B-29s of most of their defensive guns to carry more bombs. He ordered them to fly at night, at altitudes of only 5,000 to 10,000 feet, low enough to avoid the jet streams, low enough to strike directly at the heart of Japan's cities. The Americans would no longer aim for factories. They would burn the cities themselves. It was a brutal calculation, one that would change the nature of war forever. For the Japanese pilots and civilians alike, the realization came slowly, like the approach of a storm. The raids were no longer just attacks on industry or military targets. They were attacks on life itself, on the homes, streets, and families that made up the fabric of Japan. By March 1945, the B-29s had become more than a weapon. They were a symbol of inevitability, the sound of an empire crumbling under its own sky. Every man, woman, and child in Japan could hear it, the deep, distant thunder that rolled across the islands, the sound of the Superfortress. And soon, that sound would bring with it the greatest inferno the world had ever seen.
By early March 1945, the war had reached Japan's doorstep. City after city had fallen to American air raids. Factories were burned, rail lines torn apart, and fuel stores destroyed. But Tokyo, the heart of the empire, the beating center of Japan's power, still stood. In the eyes of the Japanese people, Tokyo was eternal. A city of wooden houses, narrow streets, and paper walls, where generations had lived and died beneath the shadow of the imperial palace. It was the largest city on earth, a sea of humanity stretching farther than the eye could see. But on the night of March 9, 1945, the sky above Tokyo began to hum. Far away on the islands of the Marianas, hundreds of B-29s were lined up in rows along the coral runways of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Mechanics swarmed around them, loading fuel, checking engines, and hoisting strange, new weapons into their bomb bays. These were not the heavy iron bombs used in earlier raids. These were M69 incendiary clusters, small, 6-pound bomblets filled with napalm gel, designed not to destroy buildings with explosions, but to ignite them with fire. Each B-29 carried thousands of them. Each cluster would burst open in midair, scattering dozens of miniature firebombs that clung to rooftops, walls, and streets before erupting into searing flames. General Curtis LeMay's orders were clear. Tokyo was to be burned to the ground. At 5:34 p.m., the first superfortresses began to roll down the runways. The sound of their engines was deafening, a mechanical thunder that shook the earth. They took off one by one, rising into the dark Pacific night. More than 330 bombers joined the formation, stretching for miles across the sky. They flew low this time, only 5,000 to 7,000 feet above the water to avoid detection and the unpredictable winds of the jet stream. The crews could see the moonlight shimmer on the ocean below. Inside the planes, men checked their maps, wiped the sweat from their faces, and waited for the first sight of land. At around midnight, the coast of Japan appeared below them, a black shadow against the silver sea. Tokyo lay ahead, asleep and unaware. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10, 1945, the first wave of B-29s reached the city. Their bomb bay doors opened, and from the darkness above, the fire began to fall. What started as a few scattered points of light quickly became something far greater. The bombs rained down in clusters, exploding into flaming sprays that burst across rooftops and alleyways before erupting into searing flames. General Curtis LeMay's orders were clear. Tokyo was to be burned to the ground. Within minutes, entire neighborhoods were burning.
Tokyo's architecture, made mostly of wooden paper, turned the city into a perfect fuel source. The flames merged into walls of fire that roared through the streets, rising higher than the power lines. The air grew hotter with every passing second. People ran for the rivers, desperate to escape the inferno. Mothers clutched their children, fathers carried what they could, but the fire moved faster than anyone could run. Eyewitnesses said the heat was so intense it boiled the water in the canals and rivers where people sought refuge. The temperature reached over 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt melted, iron rails twisted, entire blocks vanished in minutes. From above, the pilots could see the city glowing like a volcano. The light was so bright it illuminated the undersides of their wings. The firestorm they had unleashed created its own weather, massive updrafts and swirling winds that tossed even the giant B-29s in the air. Some crews reported smelling the burning city through their oxygen masks. Radio chatter filled the headsets, reports of turbulence, firestorms, and shockwaves. Some planes were thrown hundreds of feet upward by the rising columns of heat. Others were caught in bursts of flame that reached all the way into the sky. But the mission continued. Wave after wave of bombers arrived, dropping more incendiaries into the sea of fire below. By 3 a.m., Tokyo was no longer a city. It was an ocean of flame stretching for miles in every direction. The imperial palace, protected by moats and open space, stood untouched, an island in a storm of fire. Everything else burned.
On the ground, the destruction was beyond comprehension. Entire districts, Shitamachi, Asakusa, Koto, were erased. Firefighters tried to contain the blaze, but their pumps melted, their hoses burned, their water turned to steam. One survivor, a young girl named Michiko Ishikawa, later wrote that she remembered the sky itself being on fire. She watched as her neighbors ran into the river, only to disappear beneath the boiling surface. The air was alive, it screamed and burned at the same time. By dawn, the city was gone. The fires burned for hours, leaving nothing but blackened ruins and ash. The smell of smoke and death hung over Tokyo for days. On reconnaissance planes flew over the next morning, their cameras captured a city flattened and charred. In a single night, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been destroyed. More than 100,000 people were dead, more than the number killed at Hiroshima 5 months later. 1 in every 4 homes in Tokyo had been obliterated. Millions were left homeless.
The Japanese government tried to maintain order, but panic spread. Civilians fled the cities in droves, carrying what little they could. The emperor's ministers gathered in silence, staring at the reports that described the destruction in chilling detail. For many in Japan, this was the moment they realized the war was lost, though few dared to say it aloud. Yet even after the horror of Tokyo, the raids did not stop. In the weeks that followed, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities met the same fate. Each night, the same sound filled the air, the slow, distant rumble of engines, and then the roar of fire. For the Americans, it was victory by fire, the fulfillment of LeMay's grim strategy. Factories ceased production, rail lines melted, Japan's war machine crumbled. But at what cost? Some of the men who flew those missions would later speak of their unease. They had followed orders, done their duty, and survived, but they could never forget what they saw that night over Tokyo: the endless fire, the storm of destruction, and the knowledge that below them were not soldiers, but civilians. For the Japanese, that night became a scar etched into the nation's memory, a reminder of how quickly a civilization could burn when war reached its ultimate conclusion. When dawn broke on March 10th, the smoke rose high into the sky, a black pillar visible for more than 100 miles. Beneath it, Tokyo was silent. And in that silence, Japan began to face a truth it had long refused to see. The war was no longer about victory. It was about survival.
The fire over Tokyo changed everything. For the first time, Japan had felt the full, unrestrained power of the American war machine. Entire districts had vanished overnight. The sky itself had turned against them. And yet, in the ashes of Tokyo, there remained those who refused to surrender. Men who believed that if they could not save their cities, they could at least strike back against the giants in the sky. In the spring of 1945, Japan's air defense was in chaos. The once feared Imperial Air Force had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were nearly impossible to find. Pilots who once trained for years were now being rushed into combat after only a few hours of flight instruction. Still, the orders from the High Command were clear: defend the homeland at any cost. Across the country, new airfields were built, hastily carved into rice paddies and fields. Squadrons of fighters, some obsolete, some experimental, were positioned along the coasts. Every time the radar screens flickered with approaching dots, sirens wailed, and young pilots climbed into their cockpits, engines roaring to life, ready to face an enemy they could barely reach. The main weapon in Japan's defense was the Nakajima Ki-84, known to the Allies as the Frank. It was fast, agile, and could climb higher than most of its predecessors. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was deadly. But there were too few of them and too few pilots left who knew how to fight. The Americans had learned to fly at night,
at low altitude, avoiding radar and maximizing the chaos. The Japanese defenders never knew where the next strike would fall. One night it would be Tokyo, the next Osaka, Nagoya, or Kobe. And every night the B-29s came. In the air, the battles were brief and brutal. Pilots like Major Teruhiko Kobayashi, one of Japan's few remaining aces, led desperate interception missions against the B-29s. He once described the sight of a night raid as a river of silver flowing through the darkness. He and his men would climb through clouds of searchlights and flak bursts, the smell of oil and burning rubber filling their cockpits. They would dive at the bombers head-on, firing everything they had, knowing they might not come back. But the B-29s were relentless. Their gunners were well-trained, their formations tight, their armor strong. Even when a Japanese fighter scored a hit, the bomber often continued flying, flames trailing from its engines, until it reached home. By mid-1945, the Japanese began to experiment with kamikaze interceptors, suicide pilots tasked with ramming the B-29s directly. To many of them, it was not madness, but duty. They believed that one life given could save 1,000 on the ground. In secret bases outside Tokyo and on the island of Kyushu, special units were formed. Young men wrote farewell letters, strapped rising sun headbands around their foreheads, and climbed into their aircraft, often stripped of armor and guns, to make them lighter and faster. Their mission was simple: find the B-29s and crash into them. But the reality was far more tragic. Most never reached their targets. The altitude difference, the darkness, and the B-29's defensive guns made interception nearly impossible. Some collided with bombers and brought them down in flaming arcs through the sky. Others vanished into the clouds, never to be seen again.
One of the most haunting accounts came from a B-29 gunner who watched a Japanese fighter climb toward them from below. The fighter came so close that he could see the pilot's face illuminated by firelight. Young, determined, unafraid. A second later, the plane disintegrated under machine gun fire. For a brief moment, the gunner later said, it felt less like a victory and more like watching someone fall from heaven. Desperation also drove Japan's scientists and engineers to create new kinds of aircraft, strange and desperate inventions born of a collapsing empire. Among them was the Kawasaki K-61 Heian, nicknamed Tony by the Allies, Japan's only liquid-cooled fighter, modeled after German designs. It could sometimes climb high enough to reach the B-29s, but its engines were unreliable and often burst into flames. Then came the K-44 Shuki, or Tojo, fast but difficult to handle, armed with 40mm cannons designed specifically to destroy bombers. The recoil from these guns was so violent that firing them could stall the aircraft. Yet pilots flew them anyway, firing at the silver shapes above, hoping for a miracle. Even more desperate were the rocket-powered interceptors, such as the Mitsubishi J-8M Shusui, modeled after the German Me-163 Comet. It was designed to climb straight up into the sky, strike a formation of B-29s, and then glide back to Earth. Only a few were ever built. The first test flight ended in an explosion that killed the pilot instantly. Japan was running out of time, out of fuel, out of everything. Still, the bombers came. By May 1945, American raids had destroyed most of Japan's major cities. The firebombing of Tokyo was followed by the burning of Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, and over 60 other urban centers. In some places, nothing was left but the skeletons of chimneys and the outlines of streets carved into the ashes. For the Japanese people, life became a routine of fear and survival. Every night the sirens sounded. Families fled to air raid shelters or riversides. They carried buckets of water, hoping to extinguish the flames when they came. They prayed to the emperor, to the spirits, to anything that might protect them from the fire that fell from the sky. By June, even the smallest towns were being targeted. The Americans had run out of large cities to burn. Their bombers now struck anything that remained: rail yards, farms, warehouses, even temples.
The Japanese command knew it could not last. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. The once mighty Air Force was down to a handful of planes. Every day, the list of missing in action grew longer. And yet, the pilots kept flying. They took off with engines sputtering, with planes patched together from spare parts, with no hope of return. They fought not for victory anymore, but for honor, for the belief that dying in battle was better than seeing their homeland burn. For the Americans, the missions became routine. The B-29 crews began to feel a strange detachment. They would take off from Tinian, fly for hours over empty ocean, release their bombs, and turn back before dawn. They rarely saw the people below. But some nights, when the fires reflected off the clouds, even the most hardened men fell silent. They knew what those fires meant. By July 1945, Japan's skies belonged entirely to the B-29s. Nothing could stop them now. Cities were gone. Industries were gone. The nation itself was running on desperation and faith. And yet, the bombers kept coming, as if driven by a force larger than war itself. In one final act of defiance, the Japanese High Command began to plan for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the home islands. They prepared for an invasion that had not yet come, believing that if they could inflict enough casualties, perhaps America would negotiate peace. But deep down, everyone knew it was too late. Above the smoking ruins, the B-29s continued to circle, day after day, night after night, casting their shadows over a dying empire. The struggle in the sky was over. But what was coming next would be beyond anything the world had ever known. The war had reached its final act, and the Superfortress would soon deliver its most terrible weapon.
When the fires died and the guns fell silent, Japan became a land of ghosts. The air that once vibrated with sirens and engines now carried only the distant hum of rebuilding. The war that had consumed the Pacific for almost 4 years was over, but the memories of what had fallen from the sky would never leave. The B-29 Superfortress had done what no weapon before it could. It had made entire cities vanish. It had forced a nation to surrender not through invasion, but through the destruction of its spirit. Yet in that victory, there was no celebration, only a kind of stunned quiet. For the Americans who had flown the bombers, the war's end felt hollow. Their missions had become mechanical acts: coordinates, altitude, release. Now, as they returned home, they faced a different kind of silence, the one that follows when duty ends and conscience begins. Many of the men who flew those missions were barely 20 years old. They had crossed the widest ocean on Earth, watched cities burn beneath their wings, and survived. But survival carried its own burden. Some were hailed as heroes, others could never again sleep through a thunderstorm. A few returned to Hiroshima and Nagasaki years later, standing in disbelief before the quiet parks and rebuilt streets. One pilot simply said, "It's strange to see life where I remember only fire." In Japan, the survivors, the Hibikasha, lived with scars both seen and unseen. Their skin bore the marks of the blast, their memories the weight of what they had witnessed. For decades they told their stories, of children searching for water, of black rain falling from the sky, of shadows burned into stone. And in their stories, the image of the B-29 became more than a machine, it became a symbol of the thin line between progress and destruction. Under American occupation, Japan began to rebuild. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo not as a conqueror, but as a reformer. Factories reopened, food convoys arrived, and new laws were written. Within a decade, the country that had been bombed to ashes became a world leader in technology, art, and peace. The irony was not lost on anyone. The machines of war had brought destruction, but from that destruction came rebirth. The B-29, which once dropped bombs on Japan, now carried supplies and medicine to the same people it had once targeted. Some of the aircraft were even given to the newly formed Japan Air Self-Defense Force, a strange twist of fate that turned weapons of war into instruments of peace.
But the legacy of the Superfortress reached far beyond Japan. Its design, its power, and its range became the foundation of a new era in aviation. From its wings were born the jet bombers of the Cold War, the B-47, the B-52, and beyond. Each one carried a part of the Superfortress's spirit, its promise, and its curse. And with them came a new fear. The same sky that had once rained fire over Tokyo now held the threat of nuclear annihilation for the entire world. The B-29's final mission had not ended war, it had transformed it. In the years that followed, humanity learned to live under that shadow. The atomic mushroom cloud became the shape of the 20th century's conscience, a reminder of what happens when progress outruns wisdom. Scientists, soldiers, and civilians all asked the same question. Had the world truly won peace, or merely postponed its destruction? For Japan, the answer was found not in weapons, but in resilience. The same people who once dug through rubble to find water rebuilt their cities into shining metropolises. Tokyo rose again, not as a symbol of empire, but as a city of light and life. Hiroshima became a city of peace, its memorial park standing where the bomb had fallen, a place where silence speaks louder than any words. Every year on August 6th and August 9th, the bells ring. They echo through the quiet streets, over the rivers and bridges, through the memories of those who still remember the sound of the bombers. And for a moment, the world listens. The B-29 Superfortress remains one of the most extraordinary machines ever built. It was the pinnacle of engineering, faster, stronger, deadlier than anything before it. But it also became the messenger of a terrible truth, that technology once born cannot be unborn. It can be used to build or to destroy. And in the summer of 1945, humanity learned both sides of that truth. In museums today, a few B-29s still exist. Their metal bodies gleam under soft lights, polished and silent. Visitors walk beneath their wings, staring up at the same bomb bays that once held the weight of history. Children press their hands to the glass, seeing only a plane. But those who know, the veterans, the historians, the survivors, see something else. They see the fire of a world that came too close to ending itself. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Superfortress. Not the destruction it caused, but the questions it left behind. Questions about power, morality, and the fragile boundary between war and peace. When the Enola Gay returned from Hiroshima, its crew expected to be greeted as saviors. Instead, many of them described the base as eerily quiet. No one cheered, no one spoke. The men climbed down from the plane, their boots crunching against the tarmac, and simply stared at the horizon. Somewhere far away, they knew, an entire city had vanished. In that silence, the world stepped into a new age. An age where the sky was no longer a battlefield, but a reminder of what had been and what could be again. The story of the B-29 Superfortress is not just the story of a machine, it is the story of human ambition, of how far we can reach and how far we can fall. It is a warning written across the heavens in fire and light. And though the war ended long ago, that warning still echoes, because every generation must decide what to do with the power it inherits, to destroy or to create. The sky remembers. The engines are silent, but the echoes of the superfortress still drift above us. In every city rebuilt, in every peace preserved, in every moment when we look up and wonder what we've learned.